little bit better. There is a document that we're not going to go over because it's highly detailed, probably not a good use of time, but I do want to reference the document. That is a document that defines all these services. What I will say is I have shared and discussed it with Veronica. She's going to be posting that PDF, with the PowerPoint so everybody can download a document that actually defines these services. I know we haven't done a particularly good job on that, so I don't know if this will, but I can at least guarantee that it will be something instead of nothing, and we will kind of cover some of the common areas of concern and confusion with that as well. So hopefully everybody is hearing me, and that kind of describes what everybody was expecting to get themselves into here today. Veronica did ask that initial question. I guess you can chat if you either have a response to Veronica's question or you're feeling like what I just went over is totally different from what you were really expecting to get yourself into. Again, my assumption is that should be the same. So with that, I'll move on. Here is the slide that just about everybody's seen. This is a slide that's been around literally since the beginning of the 17-18 program year. I think I put this together back over the summer, when we first started doing these trainings for 17-18 in mid-August. I think we've had this one in the PowerPoint literally since the beginning of the program year. But this simply details all of the official AEBG outcomes through AB 104. So, a few years ago, AB 104 is the bill from the California legislature where the legislature basically weighed in and basically mandated that given that they're providing money for AEBG reporting, they followed up to say, and with that money, these are the outcomes that we expect to be reported through AEBG. It started with 5 outcomes, and then AEBG added a 6th. But for, at least for the last couple years, we've been reporting outcomes under these 6 categories. You can see them here: literacy gains, secondary, post-secondary, employment, wages, and transition. I've gone on record a few times as saying I'm a big fan of AB 104. Number one, because it really conforms very closely to WIOA. I'm not going to get too much into MSGs here, but we've talked about this a lot at training, where a mandate for AEBG was to align to WIOA Title II. That is, we needed to align the state AEBG reporting to the federal WIOA II reporting. And so we've done that in the regional trainings where we've pointed out these 6 areas of AB 104 through our California AEBG conform very, very closely to the federal WIOA legislation. So that's one reason why I like it. Another reason why I like it is it's pretty simple. Yet another reason why I like it is it seems to me that it does cover the areas that we are interested in making sure our students gain. So, and it's also provided these 6 categories. So what I've also mentioned in regional training, no slide on this, but we've talked about it a good bit now, for at least the last 6 or 8 months. That is, we've talked about how last year it was very clear that we had these 6 categories. So a year ago when we first started doing the trainings, we did outline these 6 areas in detail, but last year you might say we didn't really have anything much more specific than that. It was very ambiguous beyond that, but we've talked since August about how we've had these summer meetings, where we've met with some field representatives and state-level representatives to talk in more detail about what kind of outcomes we need to be reporting for AEBG. So once we concluded those discussions around the 1st of August, we were able to flesh this out and provide these more detailed outcomes. So since the start of 17-18, we've not only had these 6 areas of AB 104, but as you can see on this slide, we've had these more specific areas under each category that we've been responsible for, again, since the start of the 17-18 year. So fast forward to last Wednesday, that was kind of the first salvo, bringing up, how we finally got it updated in TE. So we've got the updates in TE, so the reports have been updated to include all those nifty bells and whistles we discussed last week. Perhaps more importantly, it's also been updated to reflect these outcomes for which we're responsible in 17-18. That is, it hasn't just provided these 6 categories, but it now provides more specific information for the detailed outcomes under each category. Hopefully that at least makes sense. So I'll move on with that, but there's the chart that a lot of us have seen many times. You might say also in the category is something a lot of you have seen, not all of you, but most of you. Here is that infamous bubble boy slide that I referenced. So once we started specifying at the beginning of the year not only what categories but what specific outcomes we were required to track, that predictably yielded lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of questions about how do we keep track of all this, how do we know what to mark in TE, how do we know what to record when we're with our students, and so on. So that's what prompted this bubble boy slide. So what we've been showing you now for a while is, here is a screenshot of the CASAS update record. Some of you use this form, others not so much, but we've used this screenshot to show in detail exactly which update outcomes correspond to the detailed outcomes for which we're responsible for AEBG reporting. So we did it color-coded. You can see down there at the bottom, we have 6 color codings for each of those 6 areas of AB 104, and we transpose that here on the screenshot of the CASAS update record, where, again, all of the items that pertain to literacy gains are in orange, all of the areas that correspond to employment are in blue, and so on, and we've marked those specific bubbles that relate to an outcome that will yield you and your students official outcomes under AB 104 and official AEBG outcomes on that AEBG summary. That is, all the areas in which you're really trying to maximize, in those reports to show what a great job you're doing at your college or school, what a great job your students are doing in those 7 programs. You can get this easily by looking at this chart. So hopefully that at least makes sense. I'll move on for that. What we've added here, I don't think this was necessarily something that was in our regional training PowerPoint, but something we've added more recently. What we just showed here on the previous slide was using all of those outcomes and transposing it on the CASAS update record. Here's the exact same information, but here we have it transposed directly into TE software. So you can see there on the left hand, that gives the TE menu destination. This is records, student records. Again, that's in the TE menu. You go to records, student records. That's the menu option in TE that will open up the screen that has this screenshot that we're showing you here on the slide. So the actual screenshot is here in the middle. Because it's kind of hard to read the screenshot and kind of hard to read how we've coded this screenshot, we blew it up. So there's a bottom little snippet that we blew up at the bottom of the slide, and then obviously the top side. So in particular, we blew up the work results and put it on the top part of the slide. We blew up the education results and blew it up on the bottom part of the slide. But you can see up here in the upper right-hand corner, just like we did on that bubble boy slide, we provided a little coding system for each of those 6 areas of AB 104 and just added that to each of these little check boxes here under work results and education results. So just as we did On the update record, we did the same sort of thing here for the TE screenshot, where you can go ahead and see exactly which checkboxes in TE correspond to the official AB 104 outcomes. The enter college actually is a post-secondary. I see your question, Bethany. The enter college, again, if you look at it literally, you might say that actually corresponds to both post-secondary and transition. So your question's definitely on the right track. I think the best way to explain that is there were a lot of command decisions. So just like we've been explaining here for the last few months in response to these Bubble Boy slides, there were a lot of command decisions we had to make very quickly at the beginning of the year in terms of deciding exactly which bubbles and exactly which checkboxes would correspond to these outcomes. I think the more detailed explanation would be, and this might be TMI here, is we've been using enter college as a post-secondary outcome under WIOA for a very, very long time. It relates to the core performance follow-up that some of you have known and loved for a long time. Enter college has been part of that for a long time. So enter college, you might say, was already taken by that enter post-secondary that we've been using in the WIOA world for a while. So because we've been using enter college in the WIOA world for much longer than this, we continue to use enter college as a post-secondary outcome similarly in the AEBG world. So because it was already taken for those reasons, we had to come up with something else for those AEBG specific transition outcomes. Maybe way more than you bargained for the question, but I guess because you got way more than you bargained for, that's a good indicator that it was in fact a good question, if that feather does anything for you whatsoever. Educational achievement, the educational achievement, you might say, the closest thing that relates to that are the pre-post-test gains, I would say. The pre-post-test gains are not a bubble. That's what you do through your pre and post testing. So if I understand your question correctly, Tanis, what you're getting at is going to be documented through your pre-post test results, not a bubble on the update record or a checkbox in TE. Okay, so I'll move on. Again, for your reference, there's the update record Bubble Boy slide, and now here is the more TE software specific screenshot, so it relates to checkboxes. Okay, I think, Andrew, your question is really kind of the same answer that I gave Bethany, that there's a lot of command decisions on, and again, it's not literally that this is what the outcome is, but it was just looking at, what we have, already for WIOA and using all of the stuff we already have for WIOA rather than coming up with something new. So if my memory is correct, we were able to basically retrofit all of these AEBG outcomes to some sort of bubble or checkbox we already had for WIOA. That was our goal, to not have to create anything new, to kind of keep it all retrofitted to the bubbles and checkboxes we already had. I've got to say, given how we had AEBG aligned to WIOA anyway, that exercise had some challenges, but overall, it really wasn't that difficult. So what I would just say, the terms we have on the update record or in TE are not the exact terms we're using for AEBG. The terms are what we already identified for WIOA. You might say well ahead of, any work we did identifying these AEBG outcomes. So I think the answer is, WIOA came before AEBG, so the terminology on this is WIOA specific. I've got to say, if we did it all over again, we'd do it the same way, because we really have a a greater level of requirement to make sure we correspond to what the feds have for WIOA than what we have here for AEBG. The AEBG, by definition, was retrofitted, so some of those terms are different. I know, I mean, TMI here for you, Andrew, but I know you were in those meetings. Some of those meetings might get into that level of detail, or if there's big problems for any of this, we might look at changing it. What I would just say is for this year, definitely no interest, way more harm than good changing any of these bubbles or check boxes. Perhaps next year we might rearrange it a little bit. I've got to say the answer to that question is still TBD based on whether the committees we now have for this year are going to say, hey, what we have for 17-18 is perfect. We want to leave it alone. If that's the case, I've got to be honest, highly, highly unlikely that we're going to bother changing any of that terminology. Everybody will just have to kind of adapt to what we have retrofitted. More likely, though, is that there will be some outcomes we haven't really been tracking this year. So there's bound to be something we should have been tracking and aren't really doing exactly right. If that's the case, then yeah, we'll probably have to re-retrofit. But I've got to say none of that is going to be done until after we do end-of-year data for this year. I've got to say exponentially more harm than good doing any changes now after we've spent 15 or 20 trainings, specifying exactly what everybody's got a bubble or mark. Sorry, way too much information there. So yeah, some are going to disagree with the command decision, but I stand by the fact the amount of harm is overwhelmingly more good changing in midstream. So definitely not going to do that. Any changes will be August 1 or later. Okay, so Bethany, I know a lot at Will Check entered college. So I understand what you're saying, Bethany, but I've got to just say you'll want to, look at what we have here. I think what we have is, again, the enter college is definitely simpler than what we have, but I'll just say what we have is more case specific, where we have transition to credit, and we have, there's another transition that I'm not seeing here off the top of my head here. Sorry, I can't find it, but the transition to credit and so on is more case specific. So I don't know if that does much for you, but for training purposes, you might say the word transition is actually in the one we're using for that, so that might relate to quote-unquote transition outcomes a little bit more clearly. Okay, so in any case, moving on here, I don't see any new questions, so I'll move on, but again, there's the bubble transition slide, or the bubble translation slide, and the checkbox translation slide. So now we'll move into more specifics here. So again, those two slides we reviewed relate to the 6 areas of AB 104. The first area is literacy gains. So here's just a little chart showing you the 5 areas that we're officially considering literacy gains. And again, this is more state level than issues on our part. But you might say, the way we categorized it by AB 104 category is also a little bit of a command decision, especially in this case with occupational skills gain and workforce prep milestone. At the time, we decided that we would call those literacy gains, and a lot of that related to how we were thinking they were perfect matches for measurable skill gains, which we kind of saw as being in this category. But anyway, this gives you the literacy gains category under AB 104, shows you what we in AEBG are calling the 5 sub-areas of literacy gains, and then providing a little bit of a translation chart from the official AEBG title to the title you see on either TE or the, either TE software or the update record. What I'll point out specifically is those first two. One is obviously pre- and post-testing. The other is the one related to Carnegie units or high school credits. Those, just to be clear, are not bubbles. So those aren't indicated in any way, shape, or form on either of those previous slides, and that's simply because you're not bubbling the high school credits outcome. You're not bubbling anything through pre- and post-testing either. So just to show you, that's what accounts for the fact that we've got 5 areas here, but only 3 of them have check boxes or bubbles, registered here. So moving along from that, this is getting a little deep. This is the same concept, but a little deeper in the weeds. We have those 3 of the 5 that are, in fact, represented by bubbles or by check boxes. So we've got the CDCP certificate over there to the right. We put that over there to the right because those are the 2 bubbles that we're considering quote-unquote education outcomes. And then we've got occupational skills gain and workforce prep outcome over there to the left. Those are ones that we align to the quote-unquote work outcomes. So you can see there's the 3 bubbles under work and the 2 bubbles under education that basically correspond to those 3 literacy gains outcomes under AB 104. Those are the areas that you can bubble, and you can see they're bulletized so you can match the specific bubble or checkbox to the specific outcome we're trying to report in each category. Okay, I guess I don't understand your question at all, Judy. Sorry, I guess you'll have to rewrite that. I'm not sure. The way I read your question is it's not detailed enough, and I've got to say I'm not sure how on earth we can get much more detailed than this. So I guess I'll just ask you to retype, or I don't know if I'm missing something on the level of granularity here. Again, this seems kind of obnoxiously granular to me, but if there's a level of granularity that we could get that's more granular than this, let me know. I'm thinking I'm just not reading your question correctly. Okay, so Carnegie units, hold off on that. That's a good question, Patty, but hold off on this. A couple slides from here. We'll be getting there in just a minute. Okay, actually, I'm sorry. It's 1 slide away, not a few. So here is the screenshot for high school credits. This has come up here literally in the last week. A couple people requested this, and I've got to say it was a good request. I just hadn't really thought of this. So sticking with your question, Patty, it's not spelled out exactly here, but the Carnegie units outcome has to do with high school credits. Carnegie units refers to the term the feds have labeled this. When you read anywhere related to the federal documentation, the feds always refer to this outcome as the Carnegie units outcome. Carnegie units is just a standardized way of managing high school credits. The feds call it Carnegie units because in order for it to count for federal reporting, and to be clear, that's a big issue in AEBG land as well, in order to have this work in any way, shape, or form, it needs to be something standardized so the way every agency is reporting it is the same. Otherwise, there's no way to really report it as an outcome at all. When we did those summer meetings that I've referenced a couple times already, we had a discussion on this outcome. What we found, number 1, is nobody uses Carnegie units. Number 2 is everybody does use high school credits, but generally speaking, all districts manage high school credits in a slightly different way. What I would say to that is, by different way, I mean when you look at the basic idea of, tracking high school diploma, it's usually the same. But when you're looking at the numbers everybody uses, that's where everybody gets way different. So we, in fact, have a place in TE where you can indicate the number of high school credits a student has. However, we realize that that has a 0% chance of working, knowing that everybody's number system, quote unquote, is different, where one high school district might require 180 credits to graduate, where the district 5 miles down the road might require 200 credits to graduate. That's not to say there's any difference in the way the two schools handle high school diploma, but there's just a difference in the numbering system they have to track those credits. Based on that, that's an apples and oranges comparison. So what we ended up doing to document the high school credits outcome for AEBG is we're using self-reported instructional level rather than high school credits to make sure that all districts are reporting this in the same way. So back to the screenshot, this is also something you can find by going to Records, Students, Records in TE. This is where you'll find this screenshot. So you can see I highlighted that area in TE where you record the self-reported instructional level. So in my example, I checked the box for ABEASE, and then you can see that's where you can select ASE low and or ASE high. Those are the two options that relate to this outcome. So what you would do is you would go here and you would mark ASE low upon enrollment, and then you would go back sometime later in the program year and select ASE high. What you're basically recording here is you're saying upon enrollment, this student was at the 11th or 12th grade level, and then sometime later in the same program year, or excuse me, upon enrollment, they were at the 9th or 10th grade level. Sorry, I'm reading my slide and not thinking. Upon enrollment, they're at the 9th or 10th grade level, and then sometime later in the program year, that student has made enough advancement based on your high school credit system that now that same student is at the 11th or 12th grade level. So that is, you're showing that that student who's in your high school diploma program has made progress based on your high school credits. And again, you're documenting that fact based on self-reported level. And I'll just go back and repeat myself. The reason why we're doing that is so every single agency to which this outcome is relevant is going to be reporting it in the same way, so we thereby know that it's going to be done the same for all agencies. Okay, so let's see here. Okay, as it wasn't working. Okay, it should be now. This is a new outcome. So yeah, I assume your question, Steve, relates to some of the changes. We're in the old reports. We were looking at it last year, so we weren't really getting into these specifics. We were just bean counting the 6 categories. We weren't really bean counting this level of detail. Now that we've had those enhancements here, 2 or 3 weeks ago, it should be getting into these details in a little bit more granularity. Okay, so Bethany's looking at Judy's question. Okay, so somebody else is on that. Okay, all right. So, all right, Bethany is helping out. She's not asking questions. I guess, Bethany, let me know if I'm reading it wrong. It looks like you're trying to be helpful with some of these questions rather than bringing up new questions. Okay, sorry. Hopefully I'm not talking out of both sides of my mouth. I'm trying to go over the PowerPoint and answer questions at the same time. All right, so I'll move on here. I guess if I'm not clear, okay, Marcella, if a student, okay, if they enter at the 11th grade level, then yeah, this high school credits outcome does not pertain to that student. So you might say that's the same thing as if the student pre-tested 246 or higher. I'm pretty sure, Marcella, you know EOS, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. If a student enters with a high-level pre-test, then they're basically too high to earn those gains through pre- and post-testing. They're just too high to really have any recorded outcomes. If you're the feds, you're going to say, well, hey, the only way they're going to really show outcomes is by getting their high school diploma or HSC. If they enter at the 11th grade level, the answer is the same. They're just entering at too high a level. There's really no room for them to grow related to high school credits. They can either make gains based on pre and post testing, or if their pre and post are also high, then you just got to realize that literacy gains concept may not be relevant to that student because they're too far advanced, when they enrolled to really be eligible for any of those literacy gains outcomes. Okay, I'll move along here then on that. Okay, so more on literacy gains, moving out of high school credits and into occupational skills gain and workforce prep outcome. So what I'll say, before I jump into this, I will qualify this by saying this is not an officially state-sanctioned explanation. This is just a command decision. I have discussed it with some of our state office people. I didn't go renegade on anybody here. I have discussed it with who I feel I need to discuss it with, you might say. But to be clear, this is not official state policy. This is just an effort to give you something instead of nothing. This is definitely one of the most common questions that comes up when we discuss these outcomes. That is specifically, what the heck is the difference between workforce prep outcome and occupational skills gain? When we've been doing these trainings over the last several months, we've been noting that they are outcomes. We've been providing a basic definition, but we haven't really done much in terms of clarifying, what, the difference is. So here's an example. So for occupational skills gain, what we're saying is occupational skills gain generally suggests accomplishment of a portion of a longer-term program, whereas workforce prep outcome suggests the student completed a shorter-term program. So looking at occupational skills gain, the example would be you've got a student in CTE. We'll just say they're in a longer-term CTE program for welding. For the sake of argument, we'll just pretend that CTE welding program is 5 semesters long, and that equates to exactly 5 modules. The example is you've got a skills check and or a written examination you give to that student that basically indicates that student has successfully completed Module 1 and is hereby ready to move on and enroll in Module 2. So in that example, that would be a perfect example of when you might mark occupational skills gain for that student. Again, they still have a long way to go before they're going to get that occupational licensure or certificate, but they passed the skills check, they passed a written exam, they did it, they made pre-post test gains or whatever it is you're using in that CTE program to move them along from Module 1 to Module 2. That is, they completed a portion of a longer-term program. That's an example where you would mark occupational skills gain. That's as opposed to a workforce prep outcome. So the outcome is maybe they're just taking a quick little short 15-hour class. We'll say a 15-hour class in that workforce reentry program. We'll just say that addresses different job search strategies. So it's just a short little 15-hour class. Once you're done with the 15 hours, it's all done. So that would be an example of, workforce prep outcome where it's a really short-term, endeavor, but they did successfully complete that short-term endeavor. So as a result, that would be a situation where it would be appropriate to mark workforce prep outcome. So hopefully that helps somehow. 20 weeks long, I'm not sure. I see your question, Maria. I guess the question back at you is going to be, what is the number of hours? That 20 weeks could mean, my guess is that's probably something that's occupational skills gain, so you probably would want to figure out a way to break that down into semesters or trimesters or modules or whatever. But the short answer is it depends on exactly how many hours or how you set that up. Okay, what section are these? Okay, so back to your question, Kevin, that's what we kind of covered. So again, occupational skills gain, work-based project, training milestone, workforce prep outcome, workforce readiness. So I'll just say all of these that we're talking about are in those first couple slides. I'm just going to defer that so we're not going crazy, going back and forth. So just know in response to your question, Kevin, all of these are marked on slide 3 and 4 on usually both, but at a bare minimum either those update bubbles or those TE check boxes. Okay, so moving on, once per student, but again, you could certainly have multiple literacy gains overall where maybe a student made an occupational skills gain, and as an aside, they also did pre- and post-test gains, so it would be possible for a student to have more than one literacy gain, but they would only have one occupational skills gain in a year. So they could have multiple, I guess the answer then is they could have multiple literacy gains in a year, but they could only have one pre-post gain or only one, occupational skills gain or only one workforce prep milestone. So if you're talking AB 104 category, they could definitely have more than one, but if you're talking about specific outcome, then yes, they could only have one. Okay, so moving on here, moving out of literacy gain, here's the next two categories, one for employment, one for wages. As we've talked about a lot in the regional trainings, it goes without saying the primary way we're going to be collecting data on employment and wages is really going to be more through that EDD data match rather than through any data system. But for the sake of argument, we are still recording employment outcomes and wages outcomes through, TE and other systems. So with that, you can mark for employment, get a job, retain a job, enter military. For wages, mark increase wages or get a better job. Again, there's really not much more to say than that, other than if your students are telling you they got a pay raise or a job, then by all means do dutifully mark it. And again, that's nothing more than just marking the corresponding bubble or checkbox. Similarly, for the secondary outcomes, high school diploma, HSE, that will be done, through AEBG, similar to what we've done in WIOA for many years. That is the CDE HSE data match. But similarly, we will be marking those and we will be giving you credit either way. So you can mark earned high school diploma, obviously if they earn the diploma, or one of those 3 HSE exams authorized in the state of California. Any one of those 3 bubbles or check boxes will equate to a secondary outcome. Moving along, we have a lot more than that under the area of post-secondary. We've got several bubbles or check boxes that relate to that post-secondary category. So you can see we've loosely divided those different areas of post-secondary into occupational outcomes as well as education outcomes. I've got to say overall, when this relates to, I forget whose question it was, but somebody had a question kind of relating to the post-secondary literacy gains difference. Sorry, I'm forgetting the question now. But in any case, post-secondary can be a really challenging area to report because post-secondary under the federal reporting system is very, 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 very broad. So again, we're working on trying to align AEBG to the federal reporting system. So just like it already is in the federal reporting system, post-secondary is similarly very broad in our AEBG reporting system as well. I would say post-secondary is exceedingly, and you might say confusingly broad, because we have the occupational outcomes, which are considered quote-unquote post-secondary, and we also have education outcomes that are also quote-unquote post-secondary. They really, in the real world, don't relate to each other that well at all, but in the federal system, they're all considered post-secondary because it's kind of a broad way at looking at the level the feds would expect the student to move on to after they complete secondary. So secondary, like I just said, high school diploma in HSE. So if you're the feds, you would say once the student gets the diploma or GED or whatever, they're ready to move on from secondary to post-secondary. For some students, that might mean college, which relates to these education outcomes. For other students, that might mean employment or employment training, which is represented by these occupational outcomes. Sorry, that was a big, long-winded bunch of gobbledygook. Hopefully there was some sense somewhere, but just trying to explain why it's so exceedingly broad that it really does include a big laundry list consisting of lots and lots of different outcomes that may or may not relate to each other at all. So back to the laundry list, occupational outcomes, we have attained credential, occupational licensure, occupational certificate. So again, those are the different outcomes that relate to employment training. And then we have these different areas of education outcomes where we've got the different areas related to enter college. Hopefully that makes sense at least a little bit, but these all relate to post-secondary. Okay, moving on, and again, this is another big question generator here where, similar to that occupational skills gain question, another really common question is, what's the difference between how you record these occupational related outcomes in literacy gains versus, how you would mark it and have it rise to the level of post-secondary? Everybody kind of understands the fact that you're looking at occupational training related outcomes. That seems to make sense to everybody, but where everybody gets confused is, when do we consider that a literacy gains outcome versus when do you consider it a post-secondary outcome? So you can see on the left-hand side, there's the three areas that we're considering post-secondary versus those two outcomes we've defined under literacy gains. The short outcome is, if it rises to the level of post-secondary, you might say it's a quote-unquote bigger deal, or if you prefer, a longer-term outcome than if it's simply a literacy gains outcome. What you might have heard me say in some of the regional trainings is, when we talk about that measurable skills gains concept, what we talk about is we align our student-related outcomes to the final prize. By final prize, I mean things like get a job, pay increase, enter college, occupational licensure, high school diploma, and so on. That is real tangible things that we can hang our hat on and say, yeah, here's a real obvious outcome that we want to mark. But when we dig deeper in the weeds related to measurable skill gain, we talk about how if we rely on the final prize, for some students that's going to look great, but for many of our students that's not going to look so good, because we know we've got some students who do a great job during the year, but they don't get the final prize of get a job or enter college or whatever, because those kind of final prize outcomes typically take a long time to achieve. And so it's not that the student isn't doing a terrific job, it's just simply that they need more time to get the diploma, enter college, get that job or whatever. So post-secondary, you might say, is a final prize outcome that suggests they're entering college, they're getting their college degree on one side of the fence, or if they're in the employment area, they're getting that occupational licensure or occupational certificate. That is back to that, I'm going to go back because I think it ties together to that previous slide where you would mark occupational skills gain, and this might have been how I should have marked it on the slide, where if they get the occupational skills gain, that suggests that they've completed the skills check or the written test or whatever, where they're done with Module 1, they're successfully ready to move on to Module 2. That would be the occupational skills gain level of outcome, versus the post-secondary level would suggest that in this example they completed all 5 modules. They completed Module 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. They did all of the skills checks or all of the written exams related to this program you're offering. So they've done all of it. They've got that final certificate saying they're a certified welder. So once they've done all 5 modules, then it's not just an occupational skills gain. Now it's risen to the level of post-secondary. So hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that makes sense somehow, some way. I see your question, Sylvia. That's a few slides away, so more on that here in a few minutes. But anyway, back to this slide. If it's the occupational skills gain, that suggests they're making wonderful progress, but they're just making progress. They're not through at all. If you're saying the post-secondary, then that suggests, yes, they've got the final prize. They didn't just get one module. They're now an officially certified nurse or an officially certified welder or whatever. Hopefully that makes sense somehow, some way. For adults with disabilities, that's going to be a literacy gain, where that's going to generally mean pre and post test gains through use of power, or the 2A to 5A, or if they're higher level, they could do the regular testing. But in general, if you're talking about adults with disability-specific outcomes, that's going to be on the literacy gain side, and specifically that's going to be the pre and post testing, not a bubble. That's not to say that it's not entirely possible for an adult with disabilities to get one of these other outcomes, but in general that suggests that it's a student enrolled in CTE, or enrolled in workforce reentry, or enrolled in ABE ASE, and they just happen to have a disability rather than being somebody who's enrolled in adults with disabilities specific program. Okay, sorry, once again, I'm bouncing back and forth between the slides and the questions. Hopefully that's not coming across as outrageously confusing. But I think I've covered, well, then I would just say, if you can document that in the same way you document your students in workforce reentry or in career and technical education, potentially you could mark the same occupational skills gains related outcomes for them, just like you're doing for, the CTE students. I guess in my own mind, if you're marking occupational skills gain, my knee-jerk reaction is to say, go ahead, knock yourself out. That makes a great deal of sense. If you're actually saying they got a post-secondary outcome and they got a credential or licensure or something, then you really ought to use the same standards for them as you're using for any other student, because that kind of relates to official federal outcomes and suggests they're a licensed welder or a licensed nurse. Absolutely possible, but you really want them to get to that same higher level of outcome if you're marking it just like you would any other student. Okay, I'm pausing for air here. Hopefully everybody's still with me. These are great questions. Obviously, for whatever reason, I don't know if this is going better or going worse, but obviously way more questions today than there were last week. But anyway, I'll move on to the last of those 6 areas. That is the area of transition. We'll start by the handy-dandy chart. By my count, we have 3 areas of transition presently. That is transition to ASE, transition to post-secondary on the CTE side, or transitionary to post-secondary on the college side. And you can see in the right-hand section of the chart that gets, back up, left-hand section of the chart, that gives you the official AEBG title. Right-hand section of the chart gives you the title as it appears in TE or the update record. Okay, ASE, I don't believe we have any slide on that one. So just before we get into these specific slides, I'll just mention ASE is not a bubble. That's not a checkbox, but that's something you just mark directly in TE. There's no real rocket science to that at all. All transition to ASE suggests is you have a student that enrolls at the beginning of the year in either ABE or in ESL, and then sometime later in the year, they enroll in high school equivalency or high school diploma. All we're looking at is looking at enrollment. If they enroll in ABEESL and sometime later enroll in HSE, HSD, that's transition to ASE. It has nothing to do with a bubble or a checkbox. Okay, the others are obviously getting more into those details. And again, these are my terms, not the Fed's, not AEBG's, but just to divide our transition outcomes into what I kind of consider the two subcategories here is, again, some of the transition outcomes relate to CTE or other kinds of job training. Some of the transition outcomes relate more to college, so that the bubbles or check boxes you can mark on the work training or CTE side, you can see on that top list. The ones you can bubble or mark that relate more to college appear on the bottom part of the list. Again, you can mark the bubbles or check boxes depending on what's easier for you, but these are the official outcomes that refer to those transition outcomes, just like those other areas we've highlighted. Some of the specific bubbles and specific check boxes are command decisions just based on how we had that set up and trying to align it to the federal system and trying to align it to what we're doing day to day as closely as possible. Okay, so Sylvia, I think this is your question. If you're using these two areas of the update record, that's just fine and dandy. We have been kind of underplaying this. We're still using this we're still tying these areas on the update form to official AEBG outcomes. We've been underplaying it because admittedly it is confusing. The reason why we're still using this is last year when we really didn't have much concrete information about these outcomes, we were really doing a lot, swifter, less detailed, less intensive, to wit, less, lazier way of aligning it because we really didn't have any of the details at that time. So yes, last year we were kind of lazier about it because we really had no details last year. We just had the 6 areas of AB 104. So the lazy, quick, and easy way we aligned it last year is we used these 2 fields, off the cuff, because we were very sure these 2 areas are not used at all in WIOA land, so we chose these kind of in haphazard fashion because we were 100% sure there's no way any of this is used for WIOA. So we kind of introduced this last year in the trainings we did a year ago. We introduced this and said, yeah, you can mark any of these 4 bubbles on field 12 or field 14 and get a transition outcome. So similarly, because we opened that can of worms last year, we thought it was best not to take it away, and we made it, we kept it on the table. What I would say is if it's one of those CTE or job training related outcomes, that is any of those 3 bubbles I'm describing at the top of this list here on this slide, that would correspond to either one of those 2 items here for field 12 or 14 called enrolled in training. If you're looking more at those bottom outcomes where you're enrolling in secondary or transitioning to credit, that would correspond to either one of these bubbles in field 12 or 14 that relates to enrolling in education. We're really not making any distinction, quite frankly, between field 12 and field 14, but we are going to look at all the education-related bubbles and count them as educational transitions. We are, fittingly enough, looking at all the training-related bubbles and going to relate that to the job training-related transition outcomes. Yes, they are still out. They are still applicable, Sylvia. Again, we have been underplaying them. I'll just say the only reason for that is we know it's kind of confusing, but again, we let the cat out of the bag last year, so a few people seem to like this. They're kind of in a minority, but we didn't see any upside to taking it away, so we're leaving it there. What I'll just say for those of you that see this as a ridiculously stupid exercise and an exercise in nothing other than confusion, if you're scratching this one off the list, you're missing nothing. all of the outcomes you count under field 12 or 14 are also accounted for by one of those bubbles and/or check boxes we've already detailed when we talked about those areas of transition. Okay, good question, Sylvia. Yes, I admit that's exceedingly, confusing. So it is good you asked the question, as it made it a lot easier to explain, given that you asked that question ahead of time. Okay, so I'm going to use that as a segue to move along here. That's transition. So that kind of gets into what you check or what you bubble. Here's another stab at the actual outcome that I'll just point out. These transition outcomes have also been an area of a great deal of confusion when we're doing the trainings. When we're doing the trainings, it's basically been a 4-item laundry list. For some of you that works, but for many more of you, that's just a gigantic ball of confusion. So we're trying to do it maybe visually rather than just doing the laundry list. So you can see we've got the from on the left-hand side in blue, the to on the right-hand side in red, and just showing here are the transitions you're trying to do, going from at the beginning of the year to later in the year. So the sender, quote unquote, is either going to be K-12 adult education or non-credit community college. And to be clear, for this, we're talking about ABE, ASE, or ESL only. And then so you can be in ABE, ASE, ESL in either K-12 adult ed or non-credit community college. Up there at the top, you can be in either one of those areas and transition to CTE. Specifically, that means either K-12 adult ed CTE or community college CTE. You can go from K-12 to K-12. You can go from community college to community college, or you can go from K-12 to college or from college to K-12. Any one of those different patterns is perfectly acceptable to be recorded as official transition for AEBG reporting. Then down there at the bottom, the other transition is into 4-credit community college. So again, that can be from K-12 adult ed to 4-credit, or it can be simply be from non-credit college to 4-credit college. Any one of those different combinations also successfully works as an official AEBG transition. So we had that laundry list that was that was causing a lot of confusion. So we did test this out in a couple in-person meetings. I'll just say anecdotally, when we showed this as a visual, anecdotally more people thought this was useful than that laundry list we used to use. So hopefully that's the same way here. Not really sure if that's true or it's false. But anyway, there's a visual instead of a laundry list. I'll just add what we did with the visual is the solid lines we have here suggest a transition to 4-credit community college. The dotted lines we have here suggest some kind of transition to CTE. So again, if you think this is nonsense, it's way more confusing, not less, then just go ahead and refer to that slide we've been doing since the beginning of the year with the laundry list rather than the visual we're presenting you here. Okay, back to your question, Steve. The short answer is no. Exit retained if you're marking it, it's fine. You're not in any trouble, but does it have any impact whatsoever on AEBG outcomes? The short answer is no. Okay, so Dana, it looks like, I assume you mean that question I just answered. Okay, so moving along here. Okay, so this is the final slide related to outcomes. Believe it or not, we're actually kind of on track here in terms of time. So what I did is this is actually something our TE programmers put together to, kind of put it all together. It was really more for them than it was for you, but I thought it was kind of a convenient way. Some of you, this may be too detailed, but if you just want all of this on one-stop shopping, here you go. But what this does is 3 columns. Left-hand column basically shows you which of the 6 AB 104 areas, literacy gain, secondary, post-secondary, employment, wages, and transition. The middle column shows you what the official name is for AEBG. For the most part, this is going to be the term in which you're way more familiar. But then moving on to right-hand column, it basically gives you the specific term you see in TE or on the update record. So you might say it's a full-fledged translation chart between AB 104 area, specific AEBG definition versus TE or update record definition. So this was something they put together to make sense when you're digging into these reports. You might be drilling down on that AEBG outcomes monitor. That is, you've got a number on the summary like we talked about in last week's webinar, where you might be drilling down to find more information about that specific outcome. So this is where you can kind of translate that based on what you drill down to, because I believe the report really kind of sticks to the TE-related title. For some of you that works well, but others not so much. So here's a translation chart. What I'll say is in that drill down report, there is like a little legend that's provided on that drill down report, so you can easily, quote unquote, translate what the official AEBG title is versus the title that's in TE. And again, a lot of those titles are a little bit different because the TE title necessarily corresponds to what the feds have already defined for WIOA. Again, that's back to that retrofit concept. But here is the translation chart giving you the broad AEBG definition, the detailed AEBG definition, and what you have in TE. So the report I'm talking about is the drill down report called the Outcomes Monitor. Not going to get into the details this week. Those are the details we got into last week, but that's why we created it. That's why we created this little spreadsheet, but it occurred to us that, yeah, this might be useful for other reasons. So here's the chart on this slide. Okay, so moving on here then. So we're officially transitioning out of all the issues related to outcomes, and now we're transitioning into short-term services. To the best of my knowledge, this is by far the most detailed we've ever gotten in any training to date related to short-term services. So as far as I know, for each and every one of you, this is going to be a you heard it here first. So just to summarize what you've all heard already, as we've only got one slide for that, what you've heard to date is we've talked about this one many times, where you've heard how the state does want you to record short-term services. For the most part, these are going to be your learners that don't enroll in a class. It's going to be learners that do not accrue at least 12 hours of instruction. But a lot of you have been saying here over the last couple years, well, you've got a lot of learners that don't enroll in a class or program and don't get 12 hours, but they do something as opposed to nothing. So it would really be in your best interest to document information about those learners anyway. So what we've developed here over the last year or so is this concept called short-term services, where you can document those short-term services for these students that may get counseling or mentorship or orientation or whatever, but not necessarily class enrollment or program enrollment or enough time at it to have it really constitute completion of any of these official AEBG outcomes. But again, it is something as opposed to nothing. So what we've been saying in regional training is you can mark one of these three broad categories: supportive services, training services, and transition services. And that's a way where you can quickly and easily show for those students that you did do something as opposed to nothing. And in that AEBG summary report, it has that right-hand section. This we did talk about in gory detail last week, where we have those different kinds of services. And as long as you have a unique ID for the student and you recorded the correct service, then it will show up on that AEBG summary and it will be accounted for in your official item count for AEBG, for those AEBG services. Okay, so in any case, this is what we've talked about to date. Okay, well, we've got all kinds of detailed questions. I'm not answering any of those now. That's what we're hopefully covering in the next 6 to 8 slides, is your questions reflect what we've been getting in, oodles upon oodles upon oodles of over the last few months. So that's what we're trying to define here. But again, just to summarize in the first slide, this basically represents what everybody's heard to date. We haven't really gotten into much detail than this, but we have specified these 3 categories, and we have referred you here to this area in TE. I'll move on to the next slide. That is, we've referred you to records, students in program years as the area you can go to in TE with these 3 little sections. That is a section with about 10 or 12 checkboxes apiece, that in one section for supportive, one section for training, and one section for transition, where you can check the corresponding box that pertains to the specific service you feel like corresponds best to what you provided to the student. A lot of you have been asking more detailed questions. For the most part, all we've said is use your best judgment. If you get it wrong, it really doesn't matter. All we're really worried about is which specific service, all we're really worried about is the fact that you provided these services at the state level. There's not really that much concern about which specific service it is. So to be clear, when we're looking at state level reporting, to the best of my knowledge, that broad statement still holds true. At the state level, they're still not really all that concerned with which specific service. Even though we're adding all this information, we know with 125% certainty that when we look at it broadly, we're not going to have enough detail to pinpoint this. So just know that if it's easier for you to go on the update and bubble one of these 3 or do it the other way, you're still in 100% compliance. That's just fine. What I'll just say is all of this really is more for you than it is for us, because a lot of you have been saying, hey, we understand that it's not required, but it's in our interest to get better detail. We don't feel like what you've been providing in this training is nearly detailed enough. So here's our effort to try to get more detail. So again, just to summarize, the second slide here also reiterates what we've already been talking about. That is, you can go to record student in program years in TE to mark the specific checkbox, or you could just go to update field 8 and you can more generically mark supportive, training, or transition. Okay, so for starters, we're going to talk about supportive services. So again, this is the first of the 3 categories. What we tried to do to the maximum extent possible is this wasn't just pulled out of the blue. We did go to the federal website or websites and look at some of the documentation they already have in WIOA land. So for the most part, these definitions are not really lifted word for word, but they're very, 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 very similar to what the feds have already defined for WIOA-related activities. So on the supportive services side, those are broadly services that better enable the student to participate in adult ed activities, or, to relate it to WIOA-related activities such as WIOA Title I. So they use this a lot in Title I. Obviously, when they use it there, they're relating it to the student's suitability for the WIOA I job training programs. So where the retrofit is in AEBG is we're just using the same concept for you to relate that to adult education activities. So examples would be transportation, child care, housing, and so on. So I saw a couple specific questions. So the short answer to those specific question is those would be examples of supportive services. So to lead you along, you would look on the supportive services laundry list, look through this list under supportive services. I can't remember the question now. I can't remember the, so anyway, if you asked that question, I thought somebody asked a question about child care. So you can see there's a specific bubble called family child care. That would obviously be the one you'd mark under supportive services if the service you happen to be providing the student relates to child care. So again, these are the 10 areas of supportive services. Again, potentially you could get broader than that. But for this reporting, we're just sticking with these 10 for now. We do think these 10 should cover the majority of situations you'd ever get yourself into related to supportive services. So that's the short answer. Now getting into the slightly more detailed answer, again, you can't read this. What I'll say is we do have it posted, I believe, on the website. Veronica or Daryl, I guess you can chime in whether it's posted or not, but at the beginning of this training, I sent them the PowerPoint. I also sent them a supplemental handout that provides the we won't say official, very unofficial definitions of these different kinds of services. In that document I sent them, it divides the definitions into supportive, training, transition. So I'll just say, at least for these different checkboxes we have in TE, we provided some kind of definition for each and every one of them. We did not provide a definition for all of these in the PowerPoint, but we did provide a definition for all of these in that other document I sent them for posting. Okay, thank you, Veronica. She's confirming, yes, it is already posted on the AEBG TAP website. So if you want the gory details, my suggestion is you can download that supplemental document that Veronica's already posted on the AEBG website if you want the specific definitions for all these areas. So on the slide, again, probably a little bit TMI, but just getting into some things that we thought were maybe some obvious areas of confusion. So for supportive, again, for supportive services, we're talking about direct personal support. So it's not going to cover all the counseling situations, but a lot of times if you're marking services in response to counseling, probably that means supportive services, something, again, direct personal support or personal assistance. So we'll just say things like financial or legal counseling. Again, that suggests that you're focused on personal issues rather than direct academic skills or employment skills. So again, that relates to counseling. Supplemental instructional services would also be here. So if it's things like mentorship or tutoring, that would be supplemental instructional services, and so that also fits under the supportive umbrella. And then we've got needs-based assistance. So again, it might be direct financial help or just discussion about where they might get financial help. So these bottom 3 bullets suggest that if you're directly providing some kind of financial support or federal education assistance, you'd obviously mark this, but it doesn't mean that you've got to be providing direct help. It could also mean counseling. So, hey, I'm your student, I'm in financial trouble, I need help. So maybe your response as a counselor is to have me fill out the form and bingo, I'm getting financial support. Wouldn't that be wonderful? That would be one example where you'd mark this. More realistically, you can't provide immediate financial support, but you can at least have a detailed discussion with me on where I'm getting that support. So that all fits into the same area. We're calling that supportive, whether you're directly providing the student what they want or simply just giving them more detailed referrals where they can get more help. Either one works as a quote-unquote supportive service. Okay, so moving along, I'm kind of getting this all in before I go back to anybody's questions right now. So just know I am kind of keeping away from questions for the moment. The next one we're getting into is training services. So training services would be more things that help students select programs. So it's not personal assistance. It's more directly related to things that help them get a job, help them make decisions related to jobs or job training, break down barriers so they can access jobs or access job training, do anything that directly gets at things that help them obtain or retain employment, things that help them sustain self-sufficiency, or referring them to training programs that increase their access or, promote self-sufficiency. So with supportive, we're talking about primarily about counseling and so on, addressing personal needs. With training services, we're talking about, specific trainings or counseling services that more directly help the students either get a job or access training and other resources that help them get a job. So you can see the laundry list here, but basically anything that breaks down barriers related to job attainment or, job training, you would mark training services here. What I would say is if it's anything related to that orientation, that would also, suggest that they're just doing training services. So that 2-hour orientation training, that's obviously another one that would relate here. You can see there's a bunch of specific check boxes you could use. Right, well, you could spend lots of time. What I would just say to that is I'll just revert back to what I said. If it's easier for you to just stick with supportive training and transitioning, and this just seems like a bunch of gobbledygook to you that you don't have time for, I'll just reiterate for the third or fourth time, that's 100% A-OK. The official reporting here, at least for now, is really just going to roll it up and give you an item count of the number of students who are receiving these services. But I've got to say this is way more for you than it is for us, where a lot of you have heard us out on this and said, well, yeah, that's fine, but it still really is a lot better for us and a lot better for our students if we can more carefully pinpoint what these services are. So I've got to say there's way more questions like that than there are ones that just want to keep it simple. But if you're in the category where you like keeping it simple and you think it's a big waste of your time to get in these details, just know that's 100% okay. As long as you mark supportive training or transition for each student, you're in 100% compliance. Okay, so that's training services. And then, some more stuff on training. So again, that's barriers to employment or barriers to employment training. It can be when you're providing actual training to students, or it can be when your counselors are discussing specific things related to jobs, specific things related to job training. So maybe the counselor is not directly telling the student, here's all the ways you can write a better resume or improve your job interview skills, say, but the counselor is referring, hey, I'm not sure what the answer is, but here's a bunch of places you can go to get more information about resume writing and or job interview skills, whether they're directly telling the student how to improve that skill or simply providing resources about the skill. Either way, we would call that training services. Moving on, again, just examples for common scenarios, skill upgrading, so that would be CPR training, OSHA hand washing skills, stuff like that. If you've got, a need to provide basic reading or basic math or specific ESL instruction, maybe you're offering a course like that that directly relates to workforce training or job requirements. That would be another example. Remedial training, very similar, or prerequisite training. So those last 3 bullets are really 3 different ways of just pointing out different ways of accounting for specific classes or trainings you might be providing to students that more explicitly addresses English ESL skills or basic skills that the student might need in order to meet a basic requirement for a job and or a basic requirement for some kind of job training. That all fits under the general umbrella of training services. Moving along, we've got transition services. So here's the laundry list on the screenshot. And then in general, we're talking about services that help students transition from school to post-secondary. That is, anything that's transitioning from adult ed or the community college non-credit to getting a job, helping them transition to for-credit college, helping them transition to maybe specific services that they're providing in places such as WIOA Title I. So anything that directly relates to those kind of activities, you could mark as transition services, or really anything that's looking at training that relates to competitive employment or post-secondary. So relating to a couple questions, I don't see this question, but a couple of you said, gee, this is awfully broad. This is a lot of work doing this. So again, I just reiterated, if you think that's too much work, that's fine for now. You're not under the gun for specifying. This is all just if you feel like more specificity is what you want. And I've got to say, lots and lots and lots of you have said exactly that. So, hey, you asked for it, you got it. The related question is, gee, a lot of these things you're saying is transition sure seem a heck of a lot with what you just said are related to training or even supportive. If that's the conclusion you've generated, I'd say you'd be 125% correct. There's a great deal of overlap. Again, there's no 100% specificity here. We're just trying to get a little bit better than the way we had it, because a lot of you have been saying, gee, we'd like more guidance on how to mark this. So yes, there will be overlap. So just like it's fine for you to stick to supportive training and transition, if you like that better, I'll say it's equally fine for you to read through this and just make your own command decisions. If you've read through this and you say, hey, we do a lot of counseling that relates to assisting students with job training, if you've already decided that's a training service and not a transition service, my answer would be go ahead, knock yourself out, mark it as a training service. If others of you have done the same work and concluded it's transition, not training, my answer is exactly the same. Go ahead, knock yourself out, consider it transition and not training. If you've done the homework already and you feel strongly that there's one way or the other that's better for you, you're not wrong. You can go ahead and mark it according to the formula you've already decided to do. Okay, so moving along here. Okay, so, all right, I'd say, Maria, your question is a lot like what I just said. You're not doing anything wrong. Elsa, yes, the outcome results are in the middle section of the AEBG summary. The services results, which is what we're talking about now, is on the right-hand side of the AEBG summary. Okay, Karen. Okay, for the services, yes. For the services, yes, you can go ahead and get credit for the services, whether or not the student has class enrollment, whether or not a student has program enrollment. For services, that totally doesn't matter. They'll be successfully recorded as a service either way. I'll just add for the outcomes, yes, they need class and program enrollment then. Yes, they need the 12 hours then. Yes, they need the basic demographics then. So the short answer is for outcomes, all that is required. But for the short-term services, none of that is required. And then, okay, how else would we be able to, okay, and then again, I'll just say, for entering it in TE, a million different ways of doing it. Some are saying you're just marking it directly in TE. Some of you are using the update form. Some of you have other data systems that have this and have that marked, so you could just go ahead and do that third-party import. Some of you have some other way. But again, all the same ways you're marking other data results, I guess is the best answer, is the same for the services. I'll add, some of you have decided for these services, just given all the difference in these requirements, some of you have been saying the way we do services is a little bit different than the way we do other stuff, just because the requirements are different. So again, there's no real right or wrong answer there. Okay, all the specific services show so again, I'll just say in the AEBG summary, it's going, to your question, Steve, it's going to give you the item count based on supportive training and transition, but then you can drill down to that services monitor if you want to drill down on the supportive services, say, and get a more detailed count of which students receive transportation services versus which ones receive child care or whatever. Okay, and I think we've got it just about. Okay, so one more slide here. I think this is the last one, but on transition. So a couple of you mentioned the transition testing or counseling. So in general, we're saying you're marking this for things other than the formal pre- and post-testing you're doing to document pre-post gains like CASAS testing. We're generally saying that's something else where obviously you're doing CASAS testing, but a lot of you are saying there's other kinds of assessment you're doing with your students that have nothing to do with CASAS testing. They have nothing to do with pre and post either, but you might have, psychological batteries, or what color is your parachute type assessment training to find out what's good for that student employment-wise, or maybe, whatever. But there's lots of reasons to provide, other types of assessment or testing that have nothing to do with CASAS. So that's generally what we're saying this one is for. But if you're marking that for other reasons, again, it's fine if you're marking that already. Again, career development, job development. So again, these are all referring
and thank
to,
you, Jay, for all of this
they're
wonderful
in adult
information.
education
And
right
thank you to all the
now.
participants
They're working on
for logging on to
ESL
this
or
webinar
ABE
this
or whatever.
afternoon. I hope
So now
everyone
they're
received
getting
great
ready to make
information
these
that will assist them in
transitions.
reporting their
So these are the
AEBG
sort
data.
of
Like I posted in the
services
chat
we're
pod, if
providing at
anyone
our
is in need of
agency
additional
that help
assistance, please be
transition.
sure to
So
reach
here's
out to
another
TAP
one
at
related to work. Here's another
tap@aebg.org,
one
and we will
related
definitely get you
to
the answers that you're
academic
looking
side
for.
of
In
post-secondary.
addition, we have the
I will just
CFAT
point
update
out if you
webinar
feel like
with
there's overlap or
Neil Kelly of the
similarity
AEBG
between these
office.
areas
So if
in
you haven't done so
transition
already,
and
please
the
be sure to
areas we
register
just
for
talked
that
about in
webinar. I've
training.
posted the
For
link
my
in the
2
chat
cents, you're
pod, as
absolutely
well as
right.
the
There's
evaluation
not
that's about to
really a
appear on
way
your
to,
screen.
wedge
Please be sure to fill
between.
out this
So again, you can
evaluation.
kind of
It's
go
our
either
way
way.
of
But yes,
evaluating
some of
this
these
webinar
relate to
and addressing any
transition.
professional
Yes, some
development
of these
or technical
relate to
assistance
training.
needs
You
anyone
can't
has.
really go
Again, thank
wrong
you so much for your
marking it
time
either
and
way. But
participation,
again, just
and
like
I
a
look
lot
forward
of
to
these
seeing everyone
outcomes
on Friday for
overlap,
the CFAT update
similarly when we're
webinar.
looking at
Have a
the
good afternoon.
services, there's a lot of overlap for that, just like we've already talked about with the outcomes.